Yeah, they're very interesting. I know the difficulty of really knowing that when somebody's in sleep with any signal, and especially something that you can measure easily at home. So how would you see for intradaily stability, for example, that we have had different solutions that you you put the sensor on the back, for example, then we can distinguish when the person is laying down, when the person is sitting, and when the person is standing and
Right.
walking. How do you see this kind of postural allocation, that would it give good information of this variability during the day, or do you see that it should be the movement of the wrist, that we move our arms quite a bit when we are awake and a little bit when we are in the bed and sleeping? So how do you see the different kind of things that we can currently measure, and what do you think are the best for this kind of variability measurements?
I think the posture information is definitely useful. Sleeping versus standing versus sitting. I definitely, that narrows the problem down. You definitely get back into the fact that people are so unpredictable. I think
Mm,
you can safely make, and somebody's going to prove me wrong as soon as I say this, I think you can safely make the assumption that if somebody is standing, they're probably not asleep.
most of the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you will
Yeah.
find the one person who sleeps standing up and
Yeah.
they are in your study. But sitting versus sleeping, I mean, if you can differentiate between sitting very erect and active versus kind of slumped over, there are a lot of people, especially among older people, if they have issues with, stomach issues, a lot of people sleep sitting up. And
Mm,
a lot of people will sleep like in a recliner chair in
mm,
the living room. And that seems to be a pretty common thing. So sitting, I think it'd be worth looking at, well, can you tell the difference between sitting up awake and sitting up asleep? And you might be able to tell. It might be that the awake sitting person fidgets more than the sleeping person. Laying down, again, it's a safe assumption that if the person's laying down, maybe they're at least trying to sleep, but they could be
mm,
reading, they could be watching TV. So again, it is
mm.
challenging. One thing that might be another useful bit of information is light information. If you can tell if they're in the dark or not, that might be a
Mm.
useful clue if they're at least trying to sleep.
Yeah, really, really good points. And about this interdaily stability, are you familiar with the sleep regularity index that you can calculate, and is it similar to this?
I think, yeah, it's the same basic idea, like how regular are your patterns?
Mm,
Because that can be a strong warning sign. If somebody's pattern changes, that's a good indicator that something is happening in their life.
mm,
And it could be that you have a new family member, you have a baby. That's definitely going to change your sleep regularity. But if you're an older adult who lives alone and your interdaily stability, your sleep regularity changes, that could be a first warning sign that perhaps you should go talk to your doctor. Perhaps you should have a neurological workup, that something is changing in your brain and your pattern is shifting. So that could be a good first warning sign that something is going on.
yeah, interesting. And when you said that you've been studying this interdaily stability, do you have some index, that how do you calculate? Do you have some way of giving it a number?
Yes, there is an equation, and it does give you a single number. So it and there are papers with it published, so it's a fairly straightforward equation. And yep, you just look at, basically, you take your data and you mark it as asleep versus awake, and there's a matching set, that interdaily
Mm,
stability, intradaily variability. There's a lot MATLAB and Python scripts already written that'll do this. So yeah, and it's nice because it gives you a single number that
mm,
tells you either how stable somebody's sleep patterns are and how much fragmentation. It's really useful to calculate both,
mm,
because it's very possible that somebody could have a very fragmented pattern where they nap a lot during the day and they're awake a lot during the night. But if they tend to do that every day, their stability is
Mm,
going to look really high because their days really resemble each other. So
mm.
it's useful to look at both sides of the coin. Like, are how much do their days resemble each other? And what do those days look like? How many consolidated sleep periods is this person experiencing?
Yeah, very interesting. And you said that when we age, we tend to get worse. Our rhythms are weakening, or if we have some medical condition. How well do you see that these are predicting our health? How useful would it be to keep measuring these from different people?
Well, it's hugely helpful. First off, just because sleep is so crucial. We need sleep just to feel good. It's when our brain resets itself. We know that sleep deprivation is a it doesn't take too many nights of sleep deprivation before you really start to feel the effects and you feel terrible. So it's important for that aspect, that just sleep in and of itself is very important. The other aspect about it that's important is looking at the sleep patterns gives you a window into what is happening in this person's brain, because the mechanisms of the brain that govern sleep and govern the circadian rhythm, they're very deep in the brain, and
Mm,
they are not the part of the brain that you're picking up with EEG. They're parts of the brain that you can't measure in a non-invasive way. So, looking at sleep, looking at circadian rhythms gives you a window into this deep part of the brain. And if things are starting to go wrong, that can tell you that something is happening with this. It can give you the first signs of some sort of neurodegeneration in these deep structures of the brain. So, it's a way to take a look at what's happening without, because it's just not possible to do really these deep measures unless you're putting somebody in an MRI or something like that. It's not an observation you can
mm.
do easily.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. I'm looking at my notes and they are total messes. I've been writing a lot, a lot of things. There's so much interesting points here. Do you have some interesting points you want to add in this interdaily stability, intradaily variability?
I think just that I think it's an interesting metric looking at people's health that's fairly easy to calculate using data that's fairly easy to collect. So the data, if you go ahead and just say that, all right, what we're looking at is active versus rest, and we let go of the idea that we can absolutely measure sleep, you can still get interesting information from it. And it's data that you can get from an actigraph. I mean, so many people wear devices that can measure their activity. So that's data that already exists for people. There are bed mats that you can put under the mattress to measure when people are asleep. But it's data that's fairly easy to collect over long periods of time without really asking a lot of the person you're collecting the data from, because it's unobtrusive. So I think it's an interesting metric that should be kind of standardized in the data that we're collecting about people's activity cycles.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And we actually we got a grant to measure. We are measuring with the Taiwan accelerometer that can measure when the person is sitting, standing, walking, cycling, and different activities. And then we will be using bed sensor to measure their sleep quite nicely. Do you have some ideas how should we analyze the data that we get pretty good data for probably 3 months from
Okay.
persons that we get the sleep, we get the activity and different levels of resting and being active. With your astrophysics background and looking at the different things, surface and so on, do you have some ideas what could be interesting to look from this data?
I think when working with a large data set like that is, I think it's really useful to pause for a moment and ask yourself, what questions am I asking of this data? And
Mm,
I am completely guilty of this. It's very easy to take a large and interesting data set and go down a rabbit hole of just coming up with different analyses that you can do just because you can do them. But I think in terms of really pushing your science forward and keeping it focused, it's not a bad idea to stop and ask yourself, first, like, what questions do I want to
mm,
ask of this study? And second, make sure that your data can actually answer those questions. Sit and think about, well, what are the shortcomings of my data? So if you have a group of people you're following for 3 months, they're definitely all. One thing that I would fold into that data is looking at weather data and looking at the length of the day, because that's easily obtainable information. And just you could just see how is that affecting people? How is, the number of sunlight hours that they could potentially be exposed to, how is that affecting things? So that's one data source that would be easy to take a look at. And and also things like looking for patterns. So one thing I looked at in our data sets were, what is the effect of a bad night of sleep? So with your data set, you can tell if somebody's having a night where you can tell they're up and wandering around and they're not in bed, how long does it take them to get back into a good sleep cycle after that?
mm,
So things like that is looking for patterns at different scales. So you could look at patterns over weeks, over months. How do the change of the seasons affect people's sleep and activity patterns? But you can also look shorter term. What's the
mm.
effect of a bad night of sleep? What's the effect of a good night of sleep? You can look for those relationships.
Yeah, so, sounds really interesting. And we actually have another project which is people working in a super stressful work, and they are working 3 days in a row, 12
Okay.
hours shifts, and then they have 4 days of rest, and then again 3 days, and they work from 7 in the morning until 7 in the evening. And yeah, they have problems with physical health and mental health. How do you see these findings that you have found from the variation that it's a shift work, you work 3 days very hard and then you rest 4 days? Do you have any ideas how they could improve their health with this in this kind of setup?
I would One thing that might be interesting to look at would be that recovery time, looking at the interdaily stability, intradaily variability. So during their shift work, that's going to be very regimented because
Mm,
they have an external schedule imposed upon them. So their interdaily stability is going to look very much the same. Their days are going to look the same. They might have more. And then it would be interesting to see, how long does it take them to recover? I imagine that they'll have these 3 days of intense work. They'll probably have 1 day of rest. And then how long does it take? How long is that disruption? Because one thing that could happen is you have your intense work, a day of rest, the next day perhaps you're more sleepless because your sleep schedule's been disrupted, and then you have ripple effects from that, because it might tell you how best to treat that fourth day. What
mm,
is the best sleep schedule to have for yourself on that fourth day to recover as quickly as possible from the 3 days of intense work? Do you sleep as much as possible? Do you try and maintain the same sleep hours?
mm.
What's the best strategy there?
Mm. And would you visualize it with the cosine in a way that you could show that these are the working days and then it goes different, and how would you visualize it to really show that what's going on?
So I what I would do is I would for each of your 7 days, I would calculate both of these metric, intradaily stability, intradaily variability. They both produce a single number. So each 24-hour period, you have a single number. And I would graph that so that, and if you have 3 months worth of data, that's going to be a very nice graph. You should be able to see trends. And so if there is, you should be able, those 3 days where they have this very strict schedule on them, those should really stick out. They're going to have a
Mm,
very high interdaily stability because they really look like each other. Well, then
mm,
what happens? And then
mm,
the fragmentation, what happens there? So that's what I would do is I would calculate a single metric for every one of those for each day, each 24-hour
mm,
period,
mm.
and then plot it over time.
We should maybe collaborate, yeah, on the project. And maybe one more question in this way, that I think many of our listeners are doing research on sedentary behavior, sitting, and then activity. And now they are more interested in sleep because it is 24 hours cycle that our days are, that if you sleep more, it takes away from sedentary behavior or activity and vice versa. So do you have any ideas, different ways of analyzing this, that how do you divide the day in 24-hour parts? What could be the interesting variables that you can get out? What are the important metrics that could relate to our health or physiology?
And these are things I know people are looking at, but it would be interesting to look at the relationship between when and the quality of sleep, how much sleep the person gets, the fragmentation in their sleep. And you could compare that against both how much activity and when that activity happens. We've all seen the advice, don't do intense exercise before bed, that sort of thing. Well, how true is that? How much effect does that actually have? So you could quantify that, and that would work into the circadian cycle research. How much effect not only does how much activity you have on your sleep patterns, but when is that activity? That might be interesting to look at.
No, really good points. And I think we have discussed a little bit over 1 hour, so maybe good to start wrap up. If we go back to your background with astrophysics, interest in music, what other sciences you would see that are beneficial to combine, like interdisciplinary work, that what kind of scientists should come to the research group of something else? How do you see this, that we would really get new ideas? Usually the innovations come from mixing of different backgrounds. What would be the good mix?
I think it's always good to have a mathematician. I just did a bachelor's degree in math, but I think the ideas mathematicians come up with are amazing. And like you said, just a wide variety. The other knowledge that'd be great to have in this kind of research is people who study human behavior, or sociologists, even historians, talking about how people's life patterns have either changed or stayed the same over time. There's a lot of knowledge there that perhaps our field could take advantage of if there was more communication.
Yeah, when I was doing my PhD, we had one article collaboration with the mathematicians, and it was very interesting. It was super nice. There was a researcher, and she was so excited when we were analyzing the data in a new way. And I was like, oh, I wish I could be so excited of analyzing data. So critics for Salome. It was super nice. Yeah, this has been very interesting episode. I think I enjoy the most when we have persons like you that are combining different fields. It's really refreshing to discuss. Do you want to advertise anything? Are you looking for collaborators? Are you looking for some kind of data set that you would like to analyze? Feel free to advertise anything.
So my group that I work with is the Sharp Lab at the Portland VA Hospital in Portland, Oregon. We are associated with Oregon Health and Science University, and we're led by Dr. Miranda Lim. And we are always interested in collaborating with people about all aspects of sleep and how it affects life and health and people's happiness.
Yeah, sounds good. So thank you, Christina. This is really interesting discussion.
Thank you for having me.